And
There we go. Oh,
live.
it says it's live. Okay, like that.
Yeah, when
That's
you
pretty.
press live, a different
Oh, okay.
phenomena comes forth here. We're
Yeah.
broadcasting now, Jason.
Holy shit. Yeah. Oh god.
we're gonna
And I
we're gonna be
chose to look
famous.
like this. So hold on. Let me see what YouTube looks like now. That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I run live. There's a bit of a delay.
Let's see. Yeah, it's going to be. Wait, I just want to see what the end product might look like.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can watch back on it.
Oh shit, that's myself.
As you can know, this is our first live
Oh, okay,
broadcast.
okay, okay. That was
Yeah, you
disturbing.
can
I would
actually
say.
hear it there. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what we're going to do today
Okay.
is, and the aim of this is to just meet up once a week, and we're going to be reading Hegel's Ladder and reading some good secondary literature to understand Hegel's phenomenology and
Yeah,
what Hegel is doing.
yeah.
So let's go into Hegel's Ladder. So any initial thoughts, Jason, on your sort of
I
relationship with Hegel?
I just finished this stupid paper on him, and I'm not totally tired of talking about him, so I'm that much invested.
And it's
that would
a
be
good paper.
that would be how I describe the relationship between you know, because I'm just.
It's a good paper.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm happy I finished at all. Come to a
I
conclusion.
think the thing for Hegel with me is it's a love-hate relationship because
Yeah, totally.
he's so intelligent, but he's so hard to understand. Like we will read Hegel's phenomenology and
Yeah,
thinking, oh, we'll get there, but it just takes so much
yeah.
work because he's on such a high level.
I think it's also very interesting how you know he's there's so many good conversations that can spring out of talking about Hegel completely without understanding him. You know what I mean? Like you can be a total beginner philosopher or something, and you talk about Hegel just for a little bit, and then the subject matter just becomes far more interesting. Yeah, he's kind of bigger, you know, than others.
And I mean, yeah, I'm reading at the
I'm
moment
not
Hegel and
understanding him.
Hermeticism.
Yeah.
I'm reading Hegel and Hermeticism by Alexander McGee, and it's just like a whole other side of Hegel opens up.
Exactly.
That
Yeah, yeah.
like he was a Swabian. He grew up in Swabia in Germany,
Yeah.
and Boehme was there. The Rosicrucians, Meister Eckhart is an influence. It's just and all of that sort of hermetical,
Yeah.
Gnostic, mystical element is
Yeah.
contemporary in modernity. So we don't know that part. Like some scholars read Hegel as a sort of proto-Marxist, which sort of takes all of that stuff out of Hegel, which is wrong. I
I think there's that. Yeah, sure. There's a there's a building in Manhattan that I pass by every so often in my route at work, and it's the Rudolf Steiner. If you know who that is, it's a I think it's a German mystic. It's a Rudolf Steiner Center. So they have like a bookstore and like a workshop. As I understand it, he's a mystic. I believe German. But anyway, there's like a plaque on the front, and essentially it's saying, "Oh, on the one hand, mysticism is not taken seriously, but on the other hand, you have people like Hegel taken very seriously." So, or something like that, you know, like, academia talks about Hegel. Why not the rest of the mystical tradition? So there's an entire people out there seeing Hegel as totally part of this. Tradition.
Well,
adjacent, let's say, it's not that, you know.
According to McGee, the whole of German idealism is interaction and accommodation with Boehme.
Right.
So, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Let's have a read of this. Can you see that? Okay.
It's very good. Yep.
Okay. So my internet is a bit dodgy, so we'll come back in and out. So we'll just have to truck through with it. Okay. Hegel's Phenomenology and we're reading H.S. Harris, Hegel's Ladder, if you want to have a look online and see if you can find a PDF yourself. The genesis of the phenomenology. Hegel's Phenomenology is an immense, complex book. It purports to be a science of man's experience of the absolute as a historic process of self-manifestation. According to the title that Hegel eventually gave it, it treats the phenomenology of spirit, God's appearance to man as spirit in a world historical process that began in Thomas Mann's deep well of the past. It began wherever the pre-literate tradition of our ancestors became, for the first time, a matter of record, and only now has it arrived at its completion in the writings of Hegel's Science of the Experience of Consciousness. This was Hegel's original title for this first part of the system of science, and the most obvious and non-controversial reconciliation of the two titles is provided by the recognition that the formulation of the science of experience is the culmination of the historical appearing of the spirit. The book itself is the last act of the cosmic drama that it recounts. Into his account of this drama, Hegel naturally poured all the fruits of his reading and thinking since boyhood. And for his science of experience, he utilized every cognitive experience of his own or of others about whom he had read insofar as he perceived them to be germane. For this reason, all of his earlier work is relevant to the project of the science of experience in more ways than I could possibly hope to analyze and enumerate. But although I must necessarily be selective, I want to begin by being as objective and non-controversial as I can in setting forth the facts that are most obviously connected with Hegel's great literary effort in the months before the Battle of Jena, and the lesser effort of writing his preface to the system as a whole after that. So the finding of a relatively non-controversial reconciliation of the two titles is an auspicious beginning. As the son of a senior civil servant and a member of Ehrbarkeit, the honorable class of the Duchy of Württemberg, Hegel was well educated. At the Stuttgart Gymnasium, he received a sound training in the classical languages and literatures, as well as a scientific grounding informed by the values and ideals of the Enlightenment. And he began very early to display an active and intelligent interest in the systematic organization of human knowledge. He was born an encyclopedist, but from the very first, his ideals encyclopedia was organized in a conceptual rather than an alphabetical order. Because of his obvious academic bent, Hegel was directed by his father toward a career in the church or in the schools of the church. For this reason, he entered the Lutheran Theological Institute at the University of Tübingen, the Tübinger Stift, in 1788. There he was subjected to a semi-monastic discipline, which he was quite used to, being already accustomed to a dedicated regime of studies directed by himself. And after 2 years of philosophical and humane studies, he had to begin a more strictly theological curriculum in a dogmatic fundamentalist tradition, which his enlightened training and Hellenic interest caused him to regard with violent loathing and contempt. By this time, his own inclinations were leading him to study Kant and Plato side by side, and to examine the problem of how classical rationalism could be reconciled with modern critical rationalism. During the 2 years after the arrival of the Stift, the Bastille was stormed and a revolutionary government took over in Paris. The Stift was full of political excitement, and our rebellious student of theology became a fiery political orator and a noted Jacobin. The report that head off was one of Hegel's favorite sayings, probably reflects his declared attitude toward the fate of a citizen carpet. Even more vividly, it expresses the feelings which he could not proclaim quite so publicly about Professor Storr and the old school of Tübingen theology. But Hegel's politics were actually much more moderate than the name Jacobin suggests. His sympathies were with the Grinduans, and he was very unhappy with Dr. Guillotine's new machine took their head off in terror. The first important written work of Hegel's, that has survived in the so-called Tübingen fragment. This essay shows the tension in his mind between the ethical harmony of life, which he ascribed to the Greeks, and the modern enlightenment of understanding, which he now regarded with very mixed feelings. The strong influence of Hölderlin is already in his essentially poetic idealization of the Greeks. Hegel was himself, as Hölderlin said, and as Hegel's writings at Berlin in the next 2 years were now to show, a calm man of understanding. At Bern in the next 2 years were to show a calm man of understanding. Lessing's Nathan was one of his presiding geniuses, but his Greek ideal was highly romantic. Lutwin, working in the same study room with him, tells us his hero was Rousseau, whose work he continually read. In Bern, he began to work seriously on the problem of how Christianity had come to be the dogmatic and positive faith purveyed by Professor Storr at Tübingen. The Kantian on rage claimed historic Jesus was no true reason, but a betrayer. Jesus through practical prophet of enlightenment and rational reconciliation. The historical truth of the gospel was not, indeed, the most crucial concern for him, since he was certainly conscious of improving the record when he introduced Kant's categorical imperative to it. But the sincerity of the historical hypothesis about Jesus upon which the positivity essay is based can hardly be questioned. Jesus proclaimed a religion found upon pure reason, but the Messiah image that the Jewish tradition forced upon him led to the founding of an authoritarian faith doctrine in his memory. That's profound. There seems to be some relation here between what Nietzsche was saying and the genealogy. Hegel's view of the early church owed a great deal to Gibbon's famous 15th chapter, and it was Gibbon who provided the conceptual frame for his early meditations on the puzzling question of how this positive Christianity had triumphed over his beloved Greek ideal. The object of Hegel's studies in the history of Christianity was the reform and regeneration of religious life and culture in his own Württemberg and in Germany generally. There was a group of what we may call mystical rationalists in the Stift who were united by their commitment to this goal. They had rallying cries such as the kingdom of God, the invisible church, and reason and freedom. Some of them were declared Kantians, like the Enrage, Karl Dietz, and the group of Lutwin Numerids. Others were disciples of the Württemberg theologians and the Second Reformation. And still others were simply enlightened eclectics, like Hegel and Hölderlin, who were united in their enthusiasm for Rousseau, for Lessing's Spinozism, and for Schiller's Hellenism and aesthetic Platonism. But we can see from the comparison of Lutwin's later publication with the Frankfurt manuscripts of Hegel that their watchwords referred to invisible church inspired by the Logos mysticism of the Gospel of John. In spite of their eclecticism, Hegel and Hölderlin certainly counted themselves among the Kantians. Hölderlin, who took the Hein Kai Pan of Lessing's Spinozism and his symbolum in Hegel's Stammbuch, Friendship Album, or perhaps was given it by Hegel himself, says in a letter that Kant and the Greeks are almost my only reading. While Hegel writes to Schelling that he expects a revolution in Germany from the perfecting of the Kantian system, it was natural, therefore, for Hegel to be very interested in the Fichteanist theory of the ego as interpreted by his younger and more brilliant friend Schelling. It is in this conception that we find, in his letters, the mention of a project that would struck more than one modern student as prophetic of the phenomenology. Quote, I was once minded to make clear to myself in an essay what it might mean to draw near to God, and I believed I would find in that a way of satisfying the postulate that practical reason rules the world of appearances and the other postulates. By this time, Schelling had overturned Hegel's orthodox acceptance of the moral proof. There is no necessary connection between this project of conceptual clarification and the great historical record of God's drawing near to us. Just as there is no necessary historical reference in Kant's religion or in the Critique of Practical Reason, and these are the works which inspired Hegel's fleeting ambition at the time that he was writing. He wanted to pour all of the Enlightenment insights, both classical and modern, into a Kantian mold. But the mold is already a very loose one. Reason is an intuitive awareness of perennial truth, and the Kantian system is only its best contemporary shape. Kantian practical, I think this paragraph here is something that we should come back to. I might just highlight that. The Kantian practical philosophy did, however, provide the conceptual framework for Hegel's historical research. We can see this in the first system program, which falls exactly between Hegel's Bern and Frankfurt periods. This fragment promises a complete system of all ideas, or of all practical postulates, which is the same thing. On this basis, Hegel intends to lay down the principles of a history of mankind. He has integrated the Kantian critical theory into an aesthetic speculative view, inspired by Schiller, in which the ultimate idea that unites all the rest is the idea of beauty, taking the world in its higher Platonic sense. It is poetry, and not yet a philosophical comprehension of history, that is, at the end, once more, what she was in the beginning, the teacher of mankind. But this poetic teacher, for whom the paradigm is Hölderlin, does need the philosophically and morally organized history of mankind in order to do her great work. We could argue, therefore, with some plausibility, that this is where the project of the phenomenology is conceived. The differences between this program and the actual course of the Bildung of consciousness, as it was expanded 10 years later, are crucial. The phenomenology begins with a justification of the Kantian theoretical philosophy of the understanding. Then, after a critical destruction of Kant's practical standpoint, we come to a history of mankind, which establishes the absolute or divine standpoint. So I'll just read that again. The phenomenology begins with a justification and theoretical philosophy of understanding. Then, after a critical destruction of Kant's practical standpoint in the phenomenology, we come to mankind, which establishes the absolute or divine standpoint. It is evident that there is an important relationship between the two projects, but a revolutionary inversion has occurred during the intervening decade. Our immediate problem is to establish the precise and significance of this transformation. If we assume that the system program itself reflects the influence of Hölderlin's reconciliation of Kant and the Greeks at Tübingen, then Hegel's move to Frankfurt accounts for his failure to carry it out. For Hölderlin, whose influence again became paramount at Frankfurt, as it was in the Tübingen fragment, had by this time moved through the study of Fichte to the consciousness of an aesthetically intuitive union with God and nature as his philosophical starting point. Hegel began to work at his poetic intuition into a historical theory of the forms of the union, achieved by different communities at various stages of cultural development and in varying environmental conditions. He knew that God is the shape by no means of which a community pictures its own relation to the world comes into focus here for the first time. The Greeks were ideally happy people whose gods expressed the ideal harmony of life, but they still had to recognize a fate that was above the gods. The Jews, in contrast, saw themselves as the humble servants and favored clients of that essentially alien and almighty fate whose law they obeyed. The Kantian moralists of Hegel's own time gave a new twist to this submission to positive authority by making the alien power internal to human consciousness as the law of reason. All parties recognize that fate must be reverenced. But for the Jews and the Kantians, no speculative reconciliation with fate was possible because the very existence of the breach involves a sin that can never be properly atoned for or justifiably blotted out. For the Greeks, however, reconciliation was possible because fate was only that aspect of the divine life which they had, by their own actions, made hostile. In principle, they belonged to it, and it to them. Hence, no breach could be final or catastrophic. Jesus, coming to birth in the community of absolute alienation, recognized the divinity of life in its integrity and the consequent possibility of reconciliation. But he could only express this recognition and his own reconciliation with the infinity of life by denying every aspect of the organization of human life in his actual community and sacrificing his own finite life willing as the price of that denial. Thus, he became the perfect model of an absolutely internalized reconciliation with the divine life, the beautiful soul. As his meditation proceeds, Hegel moved from the view that in the advance towards union, the lower state of consciousness is completely drowned and forgotten in the higher. Specifically, love forgets law altogether, to the view that the higher state is a pleroma, a fulfillment in which the earlier state is emerged but still preserved. That is how the word Aufheben, which Hegel had not yet adopted as part of his technical terminology, came to have the complex double meaning which it always hereafter remains in his usage. So we have this development of consciousness here. Okay. As a result of this development, the sequence of the pleroma, pleromata, in the revised version of the Spirit of Christianity, is the first clear instance of the genesis of a new objects of consciousness by determinate negation. Positive authority, moral law, Geistung, love, faith, and religion form a sequence of experience of consciousness in the manner of the Phenomenology some 8 years later. The sequence may not be perfectly worked out in the surviving texts, but it is clear that Hegel was aware of it, and it is likely that the methodic theory for it was clearly formulated in the lost system of 1800. That systematic manuscript ended with a contrast between the middle represented by the aesthetic ideal and the extremes of outward and inward positivity. It was Fichte's religion of the ego that provided the inwardly reflective pole. Hegel arrived in Jena with a very clear commitment to the superiority of the philosophy of identity that finds its standard truth in an aesthetic intuition of the coincidence of reason with actuality. This standard, which is most clearly articulated in the natural law essay, derives from his years of collaboration with Hölderlin. The absolute is an object of experience, and the intuition of it is a matter of Arntung, rather than of intellectual intuition. This conviction provided Hegel with a clear and powerful reasons for believing that the difference between the Fichte and Schelling was very much to the advantage of the latter. But in all of his discussions of the theory of intellectual intuition, Hegel was clearly uneasy, because the intellectual intuition of thinking as a concept is quite different from the aesthetic intuition of reason as an idea. The former is subjective and the latter substantial. How they are to be unified was still a problem. Difference essay was Hegel's first to deal with the conceptual subjective pole. It is obvious that he is aware of the difficulty of leading ordinary consciousness towards the point of indifference. He agrees in principle with the demand of Reinhold and Bardili that logic should be objective in the sense of being indifferent to the subject/object opposition. But he has no patience with a formal indifference, which can only reiterate the Parmenidean tautology, We can recognize the two ladders as the absolute in the difference. On the one hand, the subjective transcendental logic of the critical philosophy must be made to sublate itself in a self-critical process. On the other hand, the history of philosophy must be rewritten to display the evolution of true metaphysics, the story of the one universal reason. When Kant's critical logic has been made to destroy itself by self-criticism, his conception of traditional metaphysics as a self-destructive dialectical anarchy of opinions can be overcome. In his regular course lectures at Jena, Hegel focused on the two poles of absolute intuition. He dealt with the approach to and development of the theoretical indifference point. In his Logic and Metaphysics, and with the practical approach to and development of the aesthetic intuition in his natural law courses. But in the first term, before he was ready to embark on natural law, he offered both logic and metaphysics an introduction to philosophy. This philosophy famous metaphysics useful reason. He was setting up two different approaches to philosophy as such. One from the side of thought, critical reason, and the other from the side of life, common experience. What he has at the need for philosophy, difference, and faith and knowledge is a first guide how he started. On the one hand, it is time of disagreement and transition which need philosophy because it's a balance of universal cultural set, and there is no unanimity on goals and values. On the other hand, the reflective human being, the philosopher needs to find the way to remove all the balance of life. All philosophical mind and consciousness must feel this need subjectively, but truly speculative thinkers will also recognize it as a social requirement, and they are therefore bound to try to raise the general consciousness to a conceptual grasp of it. Critical reflection, i.e., logic, philosophers need for themselves, but a self-conscious grasp of the problem is what educated society needs generally. It is the rediscovery of speculative reason and re-establishment in society as an aesthetically perceptible ideal is to be made effective. The experiment of an introduction to philosophy was not repeated, and Hegel abandoned his first logic and metaphysics course before he got to the metaphysics. When he returned to the lecture hall, it was with a logic and metaphysics conceived in strictly conceptual terms as the parallel process of deconstructing finite reason and reconstructing speculative reason. Logic is now and obviously negative, systems reflectionis, and metaphysics is the systems rationis. The history of the one universal reason passes over into practical philosophy. It appears now in the natural law lectures as the climactic account of the evolution of religion. In other words, it is there treated in the mode in which it is experienced by ordinary non-philosophical consciousness. When Schelling left Jena, Hegel extended the scope of his systematic exposition at once and simultaneously moved back towards the standpoint of Fichte and of Schelling before the breach with Fichte. He now presented this whole system of philosophy from the standpoint of consciousness. It seems, too, that the introduction to the metaphysical first part of Hegel's very first encyclopedia, which constructed the spirit as idea, was an informal one, in which the themes of life experience and logic were combined. In a cancelled opening statement, Hegel wrote, "I develop the need of philosophy and shall proceed in this way. First, I shall define in general terms the conflict upon which it is grounded. Then I shall point to the universal forms of its resolution and make the application of them to cognition, and point out the universal forms in cognition." As soon as he got on top of his new encyclopedic project, Hegel returned to his old pattern of lecturing on logic and metaphysics and natural law separately. So the abbreviated logical cultural approach in the summer of 1803 was probably just pedagogical necessary economy. The idea of one complete encyclopedic textbook persisted, however, and we have half of it, which Hegel managed to complete at this stage before the phenomenological crisis of the system broke upon him in its full context extent. In this compendium, we find no sign of a bridge between speculation and common sense. The author of this manuscript, says Pollinger, knows neither German nor grammar. But the sharp contrast between critical logic and speculative metaphysics has now almost disappeared. Instead, we are faced with gradual and progressive modulation from negative criticism to conceptual construction. It is not surprising that an attempt has been made to intercept this draft textbook as the logic of the phenomenology itself. But this attempt is mistaken, since the logic that runs parallel with the phenomenology is the one born in that crisis, and that now follows. So, new pattern of a continuous progression from logic to metaphysics, which was probably implicit in the temporary reduction of the logic to a minimum in 1803, is accomplished or accompanied in October in 1804 by a great attack on formalism, and especially on the formalism of Schelling's school. Schelling himself is exempt from blame, but Rosencrantz probably identified this attack at the beginning of the breach with Schelling. It's for that reason, I think, that Rosencrantz thought of the phenomenological crisis as beginning in 1804. Actually, the birth of the phenomenology in Hegel's mind can hardly have come before 1805, because the system on behalf of which he was so aggressive in October 1804 was one that still confidently expected to publish in spring 1805. Rosencrantz was not far wrong, however, even if Hegel did not yet know how great this was upon him in the summer of 1804. In October, that same logician who rode roughshod over grammar and vocabulary in his half-finished textbook was telling his audience, truth should display itself to us in religion, of course, but for our culture, faith is altogether a thing of the past. Reason, with its demand that we should not believe, but know what the truth is, has grown strong. That we should not merely have intuitive consciousness for the truth, but should comprehend it. The truth of this individuality, which the path of his existence traces precisely for him, the single individual is well aware of, but the consciousness of the universal life he expects from philosophy. Here, his hope seems to be disappointed when, instead of the fullness of the life there appears concept, and in contrast to the riches contained in the world of immediate experience, the poorest abstractions are offered. But the concept itself is itself the mediator between itself and life, in that it teaches us how to find life in it and the concept of in life. But of course, only science itself can convince us of this. The transformation of the imaginative awareness of the absolute in religion into properly conceptual self-consciousness, in which the singular consciousness becomes the consciousness of universal life, is a description of the project of Hegel's phenomenology, which is non-controversial because it leaves all the logical problems aside. I'm going to read that sentence again. The transformation of the imaginative awareness of the absolute in religion into a properly conceptual self-consciousness, in which the singular consciousness becomes the consciousness of universal life, is a description of the project of Hegel's phenomenology, which is non-controversial because it leaves all of the logical problems aside. But Hegel, of course, saw the problem as a logical one. The identity must not merely be experienced, but also be able to demonstrate itself. When Hegel finally addressed the problem of our experience of truth in these terms, another revolution occurred. Logic and metaphysics coincided completely. The place formerly given to logic was now given to the science of the experience of consciousness, and the science of the pure concept replaced metaphysics. The whole complex of both of these new sciences exhibited as logic because the science of experience exhibited the conceptual structure of pure science in a shaped or embodied form, and that is how Hegel presented it. We know that he used the text of his phenomenology in his logic class as soon as it began to come from the press, and he probably used the local skeleton of it with his first sketches in his logic course in the summer of the term 1805. As soon as the book was out, he went back to announcing logic and physics as he treated the science of experience as a preamble. We may suppose that once he was free to work on the science of the concept as such, his lectures would again have become logical, metaphysical in the manner of 1804. Highlight all of this. But he was not destined to give any university lectures for 10 years after the summer term 1806. And by the time he did so, he had given up on the idea of a strictly parallel structure of science of experience and the science of logic. So the logic of the phenomenology can only be reconstructed as an inference and conjecture. It was appropriate that the earliest surviving fragment of the new science of experience deals with the appearing of the absolute in the ethical order of the Greek polis. It is also appropriate that it was written on a sheet that bears part of one draft of Hegel's letter to J. Voss. Since that letter contained Hegel's understanding to teach philosophy to speak German, we can recognize the phenomenology as his attempt to fulfill his task. And if we look at it in this light, it is clear that the comparison of Hegel's project with those of Voss, Homer in Germany, and Luther, the Bible in Germany, is no accidental one. When the crisis comes upon him, Hegel gives up lecturing on his encyclopedia altogether. He lectures only on logic, and as Gabler recorded memories tells us, that meant mainly the science of experience, with only a very schematic science of the pure concept, and on mathematics and the history of philosophy. The course of winter 1805 and 1806 was Hegel's first course in the history of philosophy, and the students were much impressed by his negative tenor, at least when it arrived at the modern period. Death himself has come among us, they said, and for many of them it was a shock to see Schelling fall to the dark angel along with the rest. But they understood that this death was also a resurrection. We have also a draft of part of the discussion of absolute knowing from the period of the lectures of 1806. If we assume that it was a draft for the summer course, then the fact that it clearly implies a different articulation of the movement toward science from that which we find in the book itself has no reliable significance. We do not know how much of the book Hegel had managed to write out in full at that point, or what shift and shortcuts he may have been driven to by the limits of the lecture schedule. On the other hand, by the intellectual excitement of his project on the other. According to his own confession, the excitement of writing the book caused him to lose all of his literary proportions. In the end, the pressure of a deadline cut the book short too. It seems certain that the chapter on absolute knowing would have been longer and would have contained more material from the history of philosophy course than it does had it not been for Natamar's promise on Hegel's behalf that the whole manuscript would be in the publisher's hands by 18 of October 06. Neithammer himself would have to pay the cost of what had been printed already at that date if Hegel did not meet the deadline. Hegel listened to the guns of the Battle of Jena with his last installment of his text in his pocket. He did not dare to set it off, and he was in grave anxiety lest the previous installment, already dispatched, should be lost because of the military disruption of communications. We ought, I suppose, to be happy with the chapters in any shape at all. But we must now turn to the question of just what is it that we have. So, any thoughts, Jason? You're still there?
Yeah. Yep, I'm here. Yeah, I just didn't want to interrupt with noises from here.
Okay, no worries.
Interesting, very interesting stuff. He
Yeah.
puts a lot of work into this way of thinking. I really love how he kind of wrote down a plan. You know, if I were to do philosophy, the metaphysics would look like this, and so on. You know,
Yeah.
somewhere up there, it's talking about that. He's a
Where
very
was he talking about?
very conceptual thinker. He was talking. Hold on, I didn't want to. All right, let me. I have a copy right here. Let's. If I can find it once.
So much, even in that like few page, like
Yeah.
so much read over and over again. And God, Christianity, come closer to God was so important.
Yeah. Well, what struck you about this?
Yeah, I just like the general. He's showing us the pregnancy that Hegel went through in a sense.
Yeah.
And the different evolutions. I was a bit confused as to what he meant by this idea of logic. What was it that went wrong with the metaphysics?
So, I'll find my passage later. It doesn't matter. So, the way I understand it, it's to do with the disconnect between logic and experience, and that's the crisis they mention every so often. That's kind of the Kantian project as well, right? To connect the rationalism with the truth of experience. So yeah. Kant maintains that this separation, right, in his philosophy, is a feature, in fact, right? Because for him, understanding the limit, understanding the separation, is what allows proper philosophy to happen.
Yes.
But Hegel just decided, you know, that's still not enough. You know, the separation needs to be. That's the way I understand it.
Yeah, I'm trying to find now. Okay, so here we have the first time he says it.
Yeah.
As soon as he got on top of his new encyclopedic project, Hegel returned to his old pattern of lecturing on logic and metaphysics, on natural law, separately. So the abbreviated logical cultural approach of summer 1803 was probably just a pedagogical necessary economy. The idea of the complete encyclopedic textbook persisted, however, and we have half of Hegel managed to complete at this stage, before the phenomenological crisis broke on him to full extent.
Yeah.
So we have the introduction is there, because he does have a footnote there. Okay, let's go to the footnote. So that's 32 as a footnote. So scroll up and we have it here. This manuscript from the main body, there's an English translation of the Logic and Metaphysics. Hegel promised an Encyclopedia Membrum. He promised again in 1805.
He promised.
So you're saying it's. Yeah, he did. Yeah. So you're saying it's to do with the distinction between logic and experience.
I think in this instance it pertains to like an encyclopedia.
Why would that be a crisis, though?
I guess if you want to write like an systematic, and then systematic philosophy is impossible, right? Basically, an encyclopedic kind of approach to philosophy, and because then you can never reach the truth, right? Truth is always inaccurate in a sense. That's how I would think about it, you know. Um, but I think here they're just talking about how yeah, there we go. Something like how natural law is different from the logic and metaphysics.
Where's this?
It's as soon as he got on top of his new encyclopedic project, Hegel returned to his old pattern of lecturing on
Oh,
logic and
yes.
metaphysics. Okay, yes, separately. There we go. So yeah, exactly. So yes, I think it does deeply has to do with this separation of
Right.
truth and experience.
Okay. Okay, so
I'm
that's
actually trying
interesting.
to find some other thing. There's a couple,
What are you trying to find?
like a
Yeah, when
passage that
Hegel, so
really.
here we have another one in on that section. We have when Hegel finally addressed the problem of experience of truth in these terms.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to read a little bit here. So the transformation of imaginative awareness of the absolute in religion into the properly conceptual self-consciousness in which the singular consciousness becomes consciousness of universal life is a description of Hegel's phenomenology. What do you think of that description?
Could you repeat it again? That's interesting. I
Okay.
couldn't really. Ah, there it is. Yeah, if you can just highlight it so I can read. There we go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
The transformation of the. Whoops. There we go.
Sorry.
Of the absolute in religion
Transformation of the
into.
imaginative awareness of the absolute in religion.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the transformation of the imaginative awareness of the absolute in religion into the properly conceptual self consciousness, in which the singular consciousness becomes the consciousness of universal life, is a description of the project of Hegel's phenomenology.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I would agree with that because there is. I think is it. Would you say that imaginative awareness is a kind of picture thinking that religion does?
Yes, essentially.
You know.
You
Yeah.
have done more work on the back end of Hegel's book, and I've done more work on the Kantian.
Yeah.
How does that statement there relate to
Yeah.
what your paper is about, sublated realism?
I decided to call it absolute realism because
Absolute realism.
because I think that's
You've
easier to.
changed your
Yeah, because I didn't really want to describe what sublation is. It's a pain in the ass.
okay.
It's just that's literally the explanation. Um,
Okay.
I didn't want to go
So
that route. There's a bunch.
because
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused as to
Mhm.
these transitional points
Yeah.
of view. So how does your study in absolute
So the way
realism
I would think
disrupt
about it,
this?
yeah. So it's to do with the this separation, right? That we spoke of just now, the between truth and experience. Um, the you wanna basically what happened was truth was basically a dogmatic function of the desire to keep rationalism. That's the thing. What people thought cognition was. It was just the form of it. People. This is what Hegel called the empty formalism. So all you have instead of being, right? It's just a kind of formulaic way to think about being. It is not in itself being. So what Hegel does is, and I think this is where he's a thoroughly modern thinker. He's very beyond his time, almost Darwinian, right? The truth of this must lie in the evolution of it, right?
Right.
How does this type of cognition, right? How does this mode of thinking arrive? Why is it so
Yes.
popular with it? Why is it unquestioned? And you look at history. There's a life. Then Hegel opens up this universe of life, right? Of
Yes.
conceptual relationships. It's
Mm.
just mind-boggling, really. It's very almost psychedelic kind of
Yeah.
way
So
of thinking. Honestly.
so we have this imaginative
Yeah,
awareness, absolute in religion, into a properly a conceptual self
yeah,
consciousness. It's I remember vaguely we were reading the end of Hegel's phenomenology last week,
yeah. It
and
was I didn't understand.
we were talking about absolute knowing, and this
Yeah.
was and just after revealed religion.
It
And
was way in the
there
end.
was elements in this. Yeah, there was elements of that in this, and there seems to be a sort of limiting or a insufficientness, an insufficient awareness in religion, and then it has to turn into a sort of absolute knowing.
Yeah, and it's interesting how this is like scientific in character, you know, so that there's you know, there is a kind of the Hegel in a way makes it true that rationalism kind of wins out in the end anyway, you know, through science, this kind of right, but not I guess in a non-religious way. I think that would be the he kind of realized this dream, you know, this ambition. Yeah.
There was another interesting thing that I found. Any other thought from you? Did you find what your passage
I
was looking for?
Yeah, I didn't find what the passage I wanted to talk about, but I did find this. Yeah. So there's a
What
passage
page?
here that says, since philosophy, it's in page 6 on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, seventh line of the second. Yeah, if you find it.
Of the second paragraph, is it?
Yeah, since philosophy. Yeah, in the second paragraph.
Okay.
Means in premise metaphysics as the story of the one universal reason. He was in effect setting up two different approaches to philosophy as such, one from the side of thought and the other from the side of life, of common sense experience. And yeah, like this really reminded me of like a commercial I saw years ago. I think it's I think Papa John's, like a pizza commercial. and at the time they had this Greek kind of pizza. You can imagine. It's horrible. I don't know. But the ad was like, oh, let me share you my philosophy of pizza. But there's
No
like
way.
Yeah. It was hilarious. It was ridiculous, and he was like,
Hegelian ad.
no, yeah. But I think it's interesting how that's like one. If you look at the way people use the word philosophy in general, oh, this is my philosophy of yoga. Oh, this is my philosophy of business. There seems to be like a practical. There seems to be like a practical dimension of it that's different from like love. That's different from like love of knowledge. Love of wisdom.
Yes.
But Hegel here he seems to be talking about this stuff. To connect this.
This is exactly what you talk about, the different levels of emergence and different levels of reality.
Yeah.
I mean, you see this in some people who are really mathematically astute, but then just socially just not there.
Yeah. It's bizarre, right? Yeah.
There's another element here.
Happiness also works like that. No, I think I was going to say like happiness also works like that, right? You can be very, very smart and miserable at the same time, and you can be pretty dumb and be very happy. Like that's like who wins in this life, basically.
Yeah, I know. No, ignorance is bliss.
Who really wins?
Now, this other element, I remember seeing a meme, and I have to look into this. But on the meme, it was like, the iceberg meme where at the very top there's like the sort of easy stuff, and then down at the bottom as it goes deeper.
Yeah.
On the bottom there, God becoming God through the Hegelian dialectic.
Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah.
And
I know what you're talking about.
And in this here, we see it's related to this. So what does Hegel say? Or what does Harris say? He says, so we have all of this Hegel and Hölderlin, we have Kant and the Greeks, we have Hegel writes to Schelling, a revolution in Germany, perfecting the Kantian system. And then we have, it is in this connection that we find in his letters the mention of a project that was struck more than one modern student as prophetic, the phenomenology. Now, I'm going back to the very, very start of this introduction. And he says here, I'm just on page 3, and
Yeah, you
he
can just read it.
says,
Seems like you're
I was
cut.
once
Yeah.
minded to make clear to myself in an essay that it might mean to draw near to God. And I believed I would find in that a way of satisfying the postulate of that practical reason rules the world of appearances, the other postulates.
Yeah. It's very, yeah, it's very interesting. So that's it. He puts primacy at practical reason, like what's outside that. I think that makes sense, honestly, because we kind of meet ourselves through I guess pure reason, right? And practical reason is
Yeah.
something that we can't really get to. So technically, yeah, I guess effectively God would be a form of practical reasoning. That's that's very interesting.
But also, I think this idea of drawing near to God is knowing as well.
Wait,
God
I
is the
can't hear it. What
absolute.
did you say?
God is the absolute.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
God is the absolute. Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting that, and I think he mentioned this as well, that religion gets to this insight faster than everyone else, in a way. That there's that there's a but they don't formulate, they don't formalize it, they don't give any explanation or anything, but there seems
Now,
to be this intuition, right, that God is the absolute. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
no, you're grand. I just on this thing of God, there's this distinction that Judaism and Christianity comes up here, right? So the view
Yeah.
that God, this reconciliation with God, as we have it here, okay? The phenomenology. So we have the system for coming closer to God. The view that God is the shape by means of a community pictures its own relation to the world, but comes into focus for the first time here. So you have the Greeks, which are ideally happy people whose gods express the ideal harmony of life, but they still had to recognize the faith that was above the gods. The Jews, in contrast, saw themselves the humble servants and forced clients of the essentially alien and almighty fate whose law they obeyed. The Kantian moralists of Hegel's own time gave a new twist to the submission to positive authority by making the alien power eternal to human consciousness as a law of reason. Okay. All parties recognize the faith must be revered, but for the Jews and the Kantians, no speculative concession with faith was possible because the very existence of the breach involves a sin that can never be properly atoned for or justified be blotted out.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is this sin?
Yeah, it's strikingly similar to the Kantian antinomies, the way I think about it. It's a kind of intuitive, it's a kind of taboo zone, right, that you cannot go beyond contradiction or something. Yeah. And it's interesting how it's a kind of instinctual dogmatic thing where there is no reconciliation with fate.
So what is it within the Jewish religion that is that sin? Is there like actual is there an actual theory of it? I mean, is there like a Jewish antinomy?
If yeah, absolutely. The kosher laws are like that, right? They're not real. I mean, they're very contrary, and it's very interesting that they seem contrary to life. Like they're very. Outside of the Jewish community, it's very hard to maintain kosher. Like it's impossible. You have to be in a bubble. So I think it's a kind of technique that they adhere to as a cohesion kind of thing. I don't know. This is a hard question, honestly. Like what is the Jewish attitude towards God that's unique, from Christianity? Because Christianity came out of Go ahead. Sorry.
What is the theoretical differences? Because Harris is making a theoretical a
Mhm.
similarity, or through Hegel, a similarity between the limitations of Kant.
Yeah.
That
I
there
think
seems to be.
literally forgive, like something like the forgiveness of original sin, is something that's very distinct, right? Which is to say, you can reconcile with goodness. You can it's not a kind of what's the word? It's escaping me. When you're trying to be practical, but you don't really codify it. Something, I don't know. It's not a it's not a heuristic that because there is a kind of, and this is my interpretation. There's a kind of heuristic approach to religion that Jews do, very characteristically. Like there's an adherence to stuff because it just works. The Torah says this, and it just works. Why question? There's this entire attitude of like, why question this bullshit? Just do it. It's fine. You get to live heaven. But I think for Christianity, all your particular quirks get to be reconciled with the good.
So, okay, so he says here, right? He goes on to say, Jesus coming to birth in the community of absolute alienation recognized the divinity of life in its integrity and consequent possibility of reconciliation. But he could only express this reconciliation in his own reconciliation with the infinity of life by denying every aspect of the organization of human life in the actual community and sacrificing finite life willing as the price of that denial. This became a perfect model for an absolutely internalized reconciliation with the divine life. Beautiful. So, is it that, again, I'm no expert on Judaism here, but
yeah, me neither.
Judaism
Don't look at me.
That Judaism is the Older Testament. We have the Torah, the Older Testament. But within the New Testament, the event of Jesus coming and saying, okay, I'm going to inhabit a mortal form here, while also being the divine and have a form of
God,
reconciliation,
right?
which you don't get within the Old Testament or the Judaic.
No, and that's a total sin. That's an absolute sin to say.
How is it a sin?
Because I think God cannot be. I don't think the Jews see that God can be corporeal in any sense. As I understand it, they don't buy into this. But I don't. They are looking for a Messiah, and I'm not entirely sure what the metaphysical description of this Messiah is. Like, is he reconciled? I actually don't know much about this. I need to look into it. Like, what does the there was a Jewish Messiah that's supposed to come back, by the way. He's been dead since like the 20s. Anytime now, I think.
Fascinating.
But I don't.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What are you gonna say?
No, nothing more. Go ahead.
Any other general thoughts?
No, just yeah. I think we get the gist of this, that he's trying to.
I'm very inspired, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, this talks about. I think this does get the phenomenology. This does recapitulate the phenomenology of spirit, because these are basically the topics you talk about anyway when thinking about it, when reading through it. Yeah.
Okay. So, do you want to do some Kant after this?
Sure. Let me find the
time.
mic. Hey, if you what? So how does this work anyway? It's going to live on your YouTube, and there's no limit to it, right? Doesn't matter.
No. So I'm gonna end this broadcast. We'll take a break for a few 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll do some Kant for the same amount of time for an hour.
Sounds good.
Okay. See you in a few minutes.
So yeah, you end it. I don't know how to do this.
Yeah. Till next time. Bye.